In terms of the background to this event, the John Muir Trust approached SEDA soon after the launch of SEDA's report, based on the series of conversations they held in the spring of this year. The conversations were called A New Vision for Land Use in Scotland, and there were six of these conversations. One of the 8 recommendations to come out of the report from these conversations chimed closely with the John Muir Trust proposal, and that conclusion, or that recommendation, was recommendation 4, that we would require climate impact certificates detailing how land was used and the impacts that land use was having. This conversation is a discussion about the merits and obstacles in implementing such a carbon emissions land tax. And I would emphasize we're focusing here on land taxes, not the more generic carbon taxes per ton of CO2 emitted. The format, the format of the conversation tonight will be similar to those held by SEDA for the 6 conversations. So we'll divide the conversation into 3 particular parts. First of all, a summary of the John Muir Trust proposal. Secondly, we'll have responses to the proposal from the 4 other members of our panel. And then we'll have a time for a Q&A from the audience. Between the sections, we're going to have some interesting interludes from artists who feel passionately about rural Scotland. And both of the pieces we're going to hear and see tonight have been commissioned especially for this event. Now, there are some housekeeping rules I'd like to run by you before we get going. First of all, could I ask everybody please to turn your video and audio functions off and keep them off for the whole event, please. This just makes the whole experience better for everyone. Please give yourself a name we can use if your question comes up. You can rename yourself if required by clicking on the 3 dots in your own window on your screen. You'll also see, if I'm sure most people will be familiar with Zoom, but there's a chat box which will be open throughout the event. And so you can use this to submit questions to the panel or leave comments, and general queries which will be picked up by our backhouse team. We'd also like to remind you that the chat is public and the transcript will be available to organisers after the event, so please do not leave anything that you wouldn't want us to see. The event is going to be recorded and will be posted on SEDA Resources webpage in a few days. We will also be asking you questions throughout the conversation tonight using a poll function. And if I can now indeed go to the first poll, which we'll take as a poll at the beginning of the conversation, but also we're going to take it right at the end. So could we have the first poll, please? And if I could encourage people to fill in the poll as quickly as they can, because we have a fairly full schedule tonight, as you can imagine. I believe we're going to have a second poll, which will follow on from the first poll before we start our proceedings. Here's the second poll. Okay, well, I think we can now proceed to the central part of our conversation tonight. That is a presentation of the paper from the John Muir Trust. The paper is entitled Carbon Emissions Land Tax, Delivering Large-Scale Carbon Capture. And we're going to have a presentation tonight from Nikki Gordon, who is the carbon officer of the John Muir Trust. Before Nikki gives a presentation of the paper, we're going to see a short film which relates to what she's going to say in her presentation.
Carbon emissions and were able to pay less tax if they changed the way they used the land to maximize carbon capture. Take, for example, a traditional deer shooting estate. Managing the land to encourage lots of deer in one area means woodlands can't regenerate. And if they can't regenerate, they can't capture carbon from the atmosphere. This would put the land in a high tax band. If that estate reduced and controlled lower deer numbers, the trees could regenerate. Other natural habitats could begin to re-emerge. The land would move to a much lower tax bracket. We're calling this idea the carbon emissions land tax. With this approach would come a variety of other societal benefits: increased biodiversity, new employment opportunities, reduced flooding, greater water quality, and improved mental and physical health for the human population. We know our land has the potential to meet Scotland's climate change targets, sequestering around 13 million tonnes of harmful greenhouse gases. That's the annual equivalent of removing every single vehicle from our roads, and then some. Take your stance for a greener Scotland. Support a carbon emissions land tax.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ronald. I'm Nikki Gordon. That film is commissioned by the Trust to sort of introduce some of the issues around land and climate in Scotland, and gave a sort of top level introduction to our carbon emissions land tax proposal. So what I want to do tonight is go over the proposal in a bit more detail, especially for those who haven't read it, and hopefully address some of the questions that some of you might have around it as well. So first of all, who are the John Muir Trust? We're a conservation charity based in the UK, and we campaign to protect wild land, but we also repair and rewild land that's in our care. And we aim to enhance people's connection to nature as well. So we developed this proposal as a response to the climate and nature emergencies, and as a way to sort of explicitly link the land management challenges with climate solutions. So in climate terms, land is really important because, first of all, it's one of the only natural sources of carbon sequestration, mainly through woodland and peatland, but also through other natural habitats. And then from a biodiversity perspective, natural habitats are integral to healthy ecosystem functioning. So if we could see the results from the second poll that you answered, you might be surprised to see, some of you, that the land use change and forestry sector is actually the highest emitter out of all of those options. So when we say land use change and forestry, we actually refer to all of the sectors that center around land management, and also the change from one land use category to another. So for example, changing a forestry plantation to restored woodland. And this specifically excludes agriculture as well. So I'll just refer to this as the land sector from here on out because it's a bit of a mouthful. So it's not only a net source of greenhouse gas emissions, much higher than you'd expect, considering that it's land and it should be sequestering carbon, But as you can see in this next picture, it actually emits 2.7 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it means that Scotland's land is no longer a carbon sink, which would be soaking up greenhouse gases. So this is really concerning, especially because we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and we want to achieve net zero by 2045. So clearly we need a dramatic shift in the way that we use our resources. We need large-scale emissions reduction across all of these sectors, but we also need to maximize the carbon removal by natural ecosystems. And there's a bit of urgency around this because the measures that we need to take can take decades to reach their maximum carbon sequestration potential. So really we have to start taking action now. So in the next picture, you can see that we calculated that restoring damaged peatlands and woodlands could sequester almost 13 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. I don't know if that picture is up, but it's essentially, so there you can see the potential for land is to sequester 13 million tons. And as a comparison, this is more than all of the emissions from the entire domestic transport sector, which is the largest emitting sector in Scotland at 12 million tons. So that's where the annual equivalent to removing every single vehicle from Scotland's roads comes from, plus another 1 million tons. So why is land not living up to its potential? This is a pretty loaded question, and we could probably do a whole conversation about this topic alone, but I'll just give you a really quick run through of the issues. So in Scotland, we have a problem with deer management. They don't have any natural predators anymore. So they eat all of the saplings before they're able to grow into trees and vegetation that would be sequestering carbon. And a lot of the estates, the large scale estates, are managed for sports shooting. So landowners maintain these unsustainably high deer densities in order to maximize the number of stags that are available for trophy hunting. And similarly, there's estates managed for driven grouse shooting, which can exacerbate climate change through burning of moorlands, which releases carbon, but also damages peat soils. And it's also detrimental to nature and wildlife because of things like illegal persecution of birds of prey, and also the legal killing of a number of animals like foxes and mountain hares, all aimed at maximizing grouse numbers for these lucrative shooting parties. I also want to point out that this tax is not an alternative to other measures being taken to tackle these issues. It should be seen as complementary and should form, part of a whole package of solutions to the issues. So there's a couple of reasons why Scotland is in a really unique and strong position to deliver natural carbon sequestration. Well, first of all, we have a lot of land comparative to the size of our population, 6.5 times as much land as they have per head as they have in England. And then if you look at the next picture, please, you can also see that there is a lot of agriculturally less productive land. So in the different shaded areas there. So these lands are less suitable for farming, and they would have historically been these vast swathes of like pristine, large scale carbon sequestering woodlands and peatlands. And you can see the geographic extent of these areas in these maps. So we have an enormous potential. So that was the context really, but the idea for the proposal itself came from an energy performance certificate, which might be familiar to you if you've bought a house or bought a new washing machine recently, but here's a picture of it as well. And this summarizes the environmental impact of a building or an appliance, and then gives it a grade depending on its performance. And it also includes the potential, so what your maximum rating could be, and gives you tips for the most cost-effective way to improve that rating. So we applied this concept to land carbon performance. And then we thought about the different methods for incentivizing an improvement in this performance. And in the end, we discussed license and various other measures, but in the end, we settled on tax. And the reason why is because taxes are really good at achieving particular policy goals, in particular, discouraging harmful behavior or inducing certain desired behaviors. And there's loads of examples of taxes influencing behavior, the most famous ones being alcohol and tobacco. But more recently, there's also the sugar levy, there's the plastic bag charge, and then there's also the London congestion charge as well. So as Ronald said in the beginning, we've seen from COP26 that many people are calling for the tax system to be reflective of the climate emergency. And on a more, spiritual level, it also needs to reflect our cultural conscience, essentially taxing what we feel as a society is bad and incentivizing what we think is good. So our proposal itself calls for a tax on land holdings over 1,000 hectares, and they would be assessed for their current carbon emissions, both negative and positive, and then for their potential for carbon sequestration. So each land holding would be placed in a banded system, as you can see in this next picture. And then they'd have different tax rates depending on their estimated emissions. So for example, you might have seen this in the video, but let's say you have land that's managed as a traditional deer shooting estate. The likelihood is that your land doesn't have a lot of trees or vegetation, which means that your carbon capture performance is likely to be very low. Let's say a G rating by the Energy Performance Certificate standards. So that means that your land is likely to be in a higher tax band. So the landowner is then incentivized to reduce the tax bill, hopefully, and the landowner starts to lower and control the deer numbers, the trees start to regenerate, and the land would move to a much lower tax bracket. So how would it work in practice? I'm sure you're wondering. So we envisage that the assessment of the land would be undertaken by public bodies, and they'd have the support of these independent expert consultants. And while we recognize that carbon storage in land is an evolving field of study, we would expect assessments to make use of as much existing data as possible. And there's extensive information available via public bodies, but also recent scientific reports that detail the different carbon stored in the different ecosystems. We would also expect that assessment would be an adaptation of an existing methodology. So that's sort of a way to further save resources and reduce costs. So for example, in the agricultural sector, there already exists a well-established tool used by the government that can help farms to voluntarily reduce their carbon footprint. So we would expect the assessment to follow a set of principles, and that would be to ensure consistency, efficiency, cost effectiveness, and fairness. And that would also then reduce the risk of challenges to assessments or to tax bandings. So once the land has been assessed, we would expect the tax to be administered by local authorities because they already have the systems and processes and expertise in place to collect these geographically based taxes. For example, council taxes and non-domestic rates. And so this is a really efficient method of administration, which also helps to keep costs low. Also, we would propose an initial pilot scheme for estates over 10,000 hectares, of which there's fewer than 1,000. So this would give a chance for the tax to be refined and adjusted, and then ensure that there's maximum efficiency and fairness before we roll out more widely. This is beneficial because it also sets the direction of travel, which gives the landowners a chance to sort of plan ahead. So there'd be numerous benefits that come from a tax like this. There would be revenues raised, first of all. Although the tax is primarily designed to incentivize behavior change, any revenues that are raised could pay into a carbon capture fund to help smaller scale landowners like farmers and crofters to help them make the transition to net zero land use. We'd also expect a net economic gain from the policy because it has the potential to drive demand for job creation in the land management and the conservation sectors, in particularly in rural areas, which could help complement these repeopling ambitions in the Highlands. And as you saw in the film, there's also multiple public benefits that come from restoring native habitats, things like improving biodiversity, more resilient ecosystems, improve soil fertility, reduce soil erosion, clean water filtration, reduce flooding, and then also improved outdoor experiences, which can lead to better mental and physical health for people. So we see this proposal as a recognition of the value of land in Scotland in tackling the climate and nature emergencies. We hope that this policy will deter and reduce emissions and inappropriate land use and incentivize behavioral change amongst landowners who are not taking their share of the responsibility for delivering on climate targets proportionate to their ability to do so. And we know that maximizing carbon capture on land will have additional benefits for wildlife and nature, but also for the wider Scottish economy, and in particular in rural areas. However, we recognize that a policy like this works best with maximum collaboration with stakeholders. So we very much see this as the start of the conversation. And we really hope that we can play our part, with the help of our panelists and people like you who've come to see this webinar, and help to drive forward the progressive change that's desperately needed in land management. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nikki. That was a very helpful overview of the paper, and I think that sets us up nicely for the panel discussion later, and hopefully some very interesting questions from the wider audience. We're going to have a short pause between Nikki's paper and getting to the panel, and that pause is going to be filled by a poem that has been commissioned especially for the event. The poem has been written by Mark Galley, and the poem is entitled Words from the Weary Wild Places. And could I ask Mark to present his poem to us, please?
Yes, hello, thank you very much, Ronald. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Galley. I'm from I Am Loud, and I'm very, very honored, very thankful to be here for a subject that is very important to me with this poem. I'm originally from sort of the Northeast, and so spent a lot of my time in the countryside, the moors, and as was said earlier, more rural areas. So when we were approached to write a poem for this, if you'll excuse the cliche, it felt a bit like the call of nature for myself. And with this poem, I really wanted to bring sort of the spirit of what we're all doing here, having these big and important conversations. And so that led me to thinking of what would these wild places, these rural areas, what would they say to us in these conversations if they could? So for your consideration, here's Words from the Weary Wild Places. Once I could hold you in one hand. It's strange to think of you like that now, as bouncing baby beings bounding out of cold ocean to boldly go forth and prosper. Each foot pressed into sand, toes pointing forward, gripping each grain as if even one pace backwards was admitting failure. Those were some shaky first steps, though, and I have seen more than my share of Bambis on ice. You were so small, so fragile. Still, with each slipped sole, you stamped heavier tread and found ground to keep you steady on my shores. I remember welcoming you into my embrace, giving you shelter in my branches, rustling my leaves, hoping you could finally dream of something other than surviving. Offered to feast in the fruits of my fields and the beasts of my being. You took to gathering well. Hunting took longer, but it was clear back then which one you enjoyed more. The food chain rattles and sings when you add a new link. I should have been more concerned with your first word. It sounded different back then. More. But I was just so overwhelmed. So thrilled to hear you speak, so happy to hear you healthy. I forgot to teach you please and enough. I wish you could remember me back then, when kingdoms of creatures claimed home to my crags, my vast expanse of my foliage covering from sunrise to sunset. Season to season, I would paint the plentiful hills pastel hues, dance to the touring bird song, hum to the tune of harmony, the true beauty of balance. Can't dance anymore. Too small, too fragile. My lands, dry and cracked habitats snapped from existence. My poor swollen peat ache under the weight of your innovation. Once I could hold you in one hand. Now you're too big to carry. You've grown so much. Haven't lost that sense of adventure. You shaped cities from the soil, bloomed communities by the riverbanks. You gave magic a new name in science, tamed the sun, wind, and waves, paving way and making space, carving your place in history, just like when we first met, trying to build something better, grow a world for those to come. You didn't know what that meant then. You do now. A corrected course still sails straight. You have been facing forward for so long, you have forgotten how to be still and listen. So hear me here. Once I could hold you in one hand. Now I need one from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was a terrific poem, and just spot on in terms of our topic of discussion tonight. Before we enter the panel discussions, we're going to have another poll. This is poll 3. So could I ask for poll 3 to be sent out? Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to move on to our panel discussion. We've got 4 speakers this evening who are going to discuss the paper that Nikki presented a few minutes ago. We've got Andrew Heald, who's a consultant at the Sustainable Plantations and Forestry Consultancy. Jenny Barlow, who's the Estates Manager of the Taras Valley Nature Reserve. Professor Sarah Ann Manoz of the Rural Health and Wellbeing Unit at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and John Cullinan, who's Tax Policy Director of the Chartered Institute of Taxation. And we're going to start this evening with John Cullinan. So if I can ask John to turn on his video now, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you very much, Ronald, and thanks to Nikki for the presentation. First of all, I think it's enormously encouraging that Nikki and her colleagues brought forward this proposal. We need, ambitious thinking if we're going to resolve this climate change issue in any way, any serious way at all. We as an institute have a number of times called on the UK government to produce a roadmap of the role of taxes in all that. It seems inconceivable that there won't have to be a bigger role for taxes than there are now, and there is a lot to think about, and they should be taking the lead. The Chartered Institute of Taxation represents 19,000 tax advisors across the UK, setting professional exams and upholding high professional standards and so on. When we comment on public matters like this, we don't try and dictate the political objectives that either the government of the day or anybody proposing any different policy should have. We try and draw on the expertise of our members to point to the practical issues and try and avoid unintended consequences, and so looking at it from that point of view. Clearly, there's a number of practical issues that arise with any tax. How actually to measure the emissions and measure the sequestration, and some of the issues around that have been kind of alluded to in the chat already. They would have to be defined sort of in law, and people would have to be given rights of appeal if they felt the authorities had not assessed them fairly, and so on. So there's, as with any tax proposal, there's always a whole lot of issues around that. There's also a practical issue, I think, around enforcement through local authorities. It's completely understandable to me why Nikki would favour that, because it relates to all sorts of other policy areas that local authorities are concerned about with the land. But the experience with the existing taxes is not kind of great, to be honest. It is more variable than enforcement by a dedicated tax authority. So there are kind of pros and cons of that, and issues of consistency. The two main areas, I think, are possibly unforeseen consequences that need to be thought through. But first of all, in relation to emissions, if emissions are penalised, I mean, let's say for the sake of argument, beef farming is affected. If the Scottish population keep on eating beef, what's to stop it being imported from abroad and the equivalent emissions taking place there? And this really has been an issue that has bedeviled quite a lot of the improvements that have been made in the developed countries towards climate change. So it's quite a serious issue. Some economists propose a border adjustment tax. The EU is looking at that proposal. So wherever the emissions are, it will not escape the tax, and that will, in principle, avoid that problem. But then you get to the issues of whether the Scottish government, or indeed the UK government, given international commitments it's entered into, has unfettered rights to do that in the way that it might have for the land tax. The other kind of unforeseen consequences issue is a little around the sequestration side. I imagine you could get more sequestration if you actually allow people to claim a tax credit. But then, of course, you'd be giving out money as well as taking it in. And so you might not be achieving any revenue objectives you've set. And there would also be the issue, which I know has concerned some people anyway, of large companies who are emitted in other respects, sort of, buying up the land to kind of offset that with sequestration. A number of the kind of comments made have shown there are concerns about the sort of distributional issues of being fair to the kind of smaller owners and smaller operators. So, and I think this does bedevil all sin taxes. I mean, Nikki mentioned taxing bad things. If you tax them enough to drive the bad thing away, you probably won't then raise any revenue. So you have conflicts between your climate change objective, your revenue objective, and in this case also social and kind of distributional egalitarian objectives. And you need to kind of be, I think, fairly robust in deciding your trade-off between those objectives, in deciding the rates of the tax and the actual amounts you're going to raise. So I'm conscious talking about practicalities and detail like this can sound rather negative. I want to go back to the first point, that I think it's enormously encouraging to bring forward these proposals, and it's filling a very sorry gap in public debate. I guess that I should leave it there. I'll ease into everybody else's time.
Thanks very much, John. That was great. So if we could hand over now to Jenny Barlow, please.
Oh, my camera doesn't seem to be working. I don't know why. Somebody stopped, my host has stopped it. So sorry you can't see me. So hi everybody, I'm Jenny Barlow. So I work for the Langham Initiative. I'm in a state, oh, there it goes. Sorry, there we go. You can see me now. So I'm an estate manager for the Langham Initiative. So I'm part of a newly formed team taking forward the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve. So before I get onto the points I was going to raise following Nikki's presentation, I thought it would be just really handy to give just a very quick recap on who the Langham Initiative are and why we're here talking about land tax. So really quick recap is that Langham Initiative is one of South of Scotland's oldest community development trusts, and earlier this year we undertook a really historic community land buyout when a large area of land came up for sale outside of Langham. So we embarked on a huge fundraising campaign. We raised £3.8 million in 6 months, and to bring 5,200 acres of ancient woodland, moorland, river valley, upland into community ownership. And we've just launched a second fundraising campaign to bring the remaining 5,300 acres into community ownership. So it's a very exciting time for us and a very new journey as a community landowner. So I suppose that's the perspective that I'm sort of coming to this with. And as a really core part of what we're trying to do is large-scale ecological restoration, community regeneration through the land, and obviously nature-based carbon capture through woodland and peatland restoration. You know, a really big part of what we want to do under community ownership is create that really rich legacy for future generations through how we sort of steward the land under our ownership. I think one of the biggest things that the biggest thoughts I've got of after Nikki's presentation and also attending the climate marches on Saturday is that, you know, we've got a huge challenge ahead of us with climate change, and we do need all the tools at our disposal, and you know, having that, we need something that's going to, all the tools we need at our disposal to get that huge transformational shift. And for us, you know, owning land does come with, you know, it comes with power and responsibility. Oh, there's the reserve there. So, you know, we've got power to make a meaningful contribution under community ownership to climate change by restoring peatlands and damaged habitats and restoring ancient forests for the benefit of our local community, but it also obviously provides those national benefits to reduce the land-based emissions and also create a much fairer and brighter future for everybody. So, you know, as a landowner, as a community landowner, we do have the power to give those benefits back to society. So I think if taxation facilitated those benefits being widely spread, then I suppose we can't afford to overlook it. And just as a quick bit of research before today, it sounds like a carbon taxation isn't new, and it has facilitated behaviour change in countries like Sweden for quite a long time. I think one thing before I finish is that one thing we're seeing more and more in Langham, and I think this is probably quite common across Scotland, is that land prices are soaring because of one of the reasons is carbon, and you know, there's a lot of corporate land banking happening, and the prices are soaring beyond the reach of communities like ours. So could a taxation system help to balance that out? A potential downside, I suppose, could be that land management, you know, if you only look at land through a carbon lens, you might potentially overlook biodiversity. So I suppose it does have to factor in the fact that, you know, the ecology of what you do, you can't just look at it from a carbon perspective. And just very finally, in terms of one of the things we've been mentioning is about trying to make the data work and have a system that makes these decisions, like facilitates these decisions about how you get the carbon benefits from the decisions you make, land management decisions. So we're a pilot site at the moment for a CivTech challenge through the Scottish Government, which is we're working to create an app that will help to facilitate carbon, but land management decisions on carbon benefits. So we're quite excited about the impact that could potentially have in discussions like this, and also, you know, facilitating that change to reduce those land-based emissions. I think that's it for me, but looking forward to the questions and discussion.
Right, thanks very much, Jenny. That was very helpful. If I could ask Andrew Heald now to make his presentation, thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Very nice to be here, and thank you very much for asking me to participate and to comment on this paper. So as per the introduction, and as just popped up in the chat there, I'm a professional forestry consultant, and I'm independent. I work for myself and run my own business. So broadly supportive of the idea of a carbon tax, but I think there's a few things to consider, some of which have already been raised by John and Jenny, but I'll just sort of highlight a couple of those. And I suppose the first one is, as John was saying, was this idea of a tax versus tax credit, or really, in addition to taxing emissions, should we also be thinking about rewarding or giving a tax credit for sequestration and for carbon storage? And those are two different things. So how do we consider that, and how do we factor this into this? And as Jenny was saying about this sort of viewing land through just through a carbon tax lens. What we're really interested in is wider social and environmental impact. And in a way, carbon accounting is just a mechanism, it's just a tool. And it's a carbon measurement is an output. And what we really should be focused on is outcomes and impact. So how do we factor that? How can we be smarter, better at measuring impact and outcome, as well as just carbon, which is a straightforward thing to measure, but it's not that straightforward, which I'll come on into in a minute. I know Ronald said that this is about carbon land tax, but I think we need to be thinking about wider carbon taxation, and we really can't. Well, we need to be careful about separating out carbon land taxes from goods and other services, and also, just be careful around there, and then also around a timescale. Land doesn't always sequester or store carbon in a kind of straightforward linear way. That sequestration can go up and can go down, or be higher and lower at certain times, depending on the management of that land. And just sort of going back, that we've already talked about sort of impact of importing beef, but we do really need to think about this off-site impact, and how we measure not just the off-site impact of, say, importing more beef from, say, South America, but how we measure carbon. And if we're doing things on the land that have an ex situ, an off-site carbon benefit, for example, growing timber, if that has an off-site carbon impact, how do we consider that, and how do we factor that into any carbon discussion? So those are the sort of bigger conceptual things. So a few more on the sort of the technical carbon measurement side. There are some really, really good tools out there, but we need to be quite careful about how we use those tools and how we use them across. They've often been developed for specific land uses. They're getting better all the time, and it's changing all the time, but we just need to be careful, particularly comparing and contrasting them across different land uses. And also around there's lots of opportunities and using remote sensing to do this measurement and the auditing, but we need to kind of think a little bit about sort of good enough, and what's a good enough tool for carbon measurement, and that we don't end up employing lots of expensive auditors to help us do this measurement for us. I used to do quite a lot of auditing, so it's good for me and my friends, but we do have to be careful. The current sort of carbon boom in carbon market is creating a lot of work for auditors and independent consultants. And again, just on that technical, a bit of a technical one again, but just thinking about when we're restoring peatland, that has a big improvement, because that's looking at emissions foregone, or emissions that are that would be emitted from damaged peatland, which can be a big source of carbon, versus a long-term carbon store in a healthy peat bog, for example, or in a mature native woodland, versus carbon sequestration. And how do we compare these three different carbon buckets, if you like? And I think the other one then is, as touched a little bit about timber, but the key issue for us is, how do we decarbonize our economy? And we have a heavy fossil fuel based high energy economy, particularly in areas around, we've already talked about transport, but also around construction. Steel and concrete manufacturing are responsible for about 18% of global CO2 emissions. And if we can get more, for example, I'm interested in growing timber, and how do we do that sustainably? If we can get more timber into construction, then we can reduce that demand for concrete and steel, and therefore we can have a quicker impact on directly reducing emissions from these high energy products. And it's not just concrete and steel, it's also in packaging. There's a lot of oil-based plastics that are used in packaging. So really, thank you for inviting me. Great to be part of this discussion. Looking forward to hearing more of the questions. Broadly supportive. And I think that idea of looking at it's great to see a policy or a policy proposal or a taxation proposal that looks across a broad range of land uses. Quite often we have a history of thinking and developing policies in kind of land use silos. And what I think we I'm passionate about is we need to look at the bigger picture across a wide range of land uses. So we're not just operating or looking at these things separately. So I think the idea of some kind of carbon-based taxation system that looks at all land uses and starts to create this level playing field across different land uses is really pleasing and really interesting to see. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was great. So if I could turn now to Sarah Ann Munoz, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronald, and thanks for the opportunity to take part in the event. It's an interesting topic and discussion that we've had so far. It is a slightly different one for me to think about. I'm a social scientist who works within rural health research. But it's been really fascinating to listen to the presentation and also to engage with that report that Nikki presented to us earlier. So I think what I would like to do just to briefly touch on some of the points that stood out to me really as a rural health researcher. And the first, I think probably more explicitly relates to health, and that was around the potential land uses that a carbon land tax may promote or may facilitate. And I'm potentially interested in that potential there for it to promote woodland creation, as been discussed previously. And from my point of view, that's because there's this really growing evidence base that demonstrates a positive connection between woodland and forests and individual health and well-being. So for me, something that promotes woodland creation, it would be likely to not just have a positive environmental impact, but it would also have the potential for that added health and well-being impacts for individuals and for communities. And that could be through both physical health, but also mental health. So I think really these kind of social benefits of woodland are now quite well evidenced and well established. I think my ask would be for woodland areas to be accessible for things like recreation and leisure. And also if there's the potential for woodland to be community owned, what we can see in the research is that the well-being potential, the well-being benefits there can be even greater if there's that element of community ownership. I think the second point really that stood out for me is one around inequality within rural areas. And I think as a rural health researcher, that's something that I'm particularly aware of, and also aware that it can sometimes be quite easy for inequality or deprivation to remain hidden within rural contexts. So I felt that potential for how a carbon land tax might affect different types of rural landowner, particularly in terms of land size of land ownership, was a really important consideration. So that was something I think I particularly welcomed within the John Muir Trust report, that recognition of size of land owning, and a recognition really that any tax would need to not fall disproportionately on smaller landowners such as crofters or small family farmers. And we can see that from the research that those types of land owners can be subject, for example, to particularly high levels of stress and anxiety at the moment already as well. I think the suggestion that the tax revenue could potentially be used to support those types of smaller landowners is really interesting and really important from that equality point of view, and also from the community benefit point of view as well. So I think that's all that I'd like to say just now. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Sarah Ann. That was good. Thanks a lot. So we're going to have I think the answer to poll 3. If we could have the results of poll 3, please, now. So clearly, everybody agrees that the basic premise of the paper today is the right direction, which is good to know. 98% in favor of that, against 2% saying no. So very clear-cut result there. Before we go into our panel discussion, we're going to have another artistic interlude. This time we're going to have some music, which I'm looking forward to. The music's from Hamish Napier's album, The Woods, and it's performed by Sue Lee and Hamish Napier. So if we could ask us now to have the video of the musical interlude, please.
Thank you so much for having us along to this online event. My name is Sue Lee and this is Hamish Napier, and we are in Strathspey.
We're going to play for you a piece of music which I wrote for my album The Woods, and this is an album that was sponsored by Cairngorms Connect, which is an amazing large-scale habitat restoration project based within Cairngorms National Park. And the piece of music that we're going to play for you is called The Tree of the Return. And the Tree of the Return is a famous local celebrity pine tree right up on the tree line in the Cairngorms, just as you approach Glen Einich. And we're going to follow that with a tune which is very valid for the climate crisis, and it's a piece of music called Wildfire.
Well, thank you very much, both. That was a delightful piece of music. Really very nice indeed. So we're going to move to a panel discussion, a Q&A session. And perhaps not surprised to hear that this evening's discussions have generated a lot of interest and a lot of questions from our audience. Perhaps I could start by asking Nikki if she would like to respond to some of the remarks made by the panelists. There were a lot of interesting points there, some relating to the practicalities of implementing the tax, and others relating to how we bring in biodiversity to the whole picture, and it's not just about focusing on carbon per se. So Nikki, would you like to come back to any of the points that the panelists made before we go to some of the questions the audience have raised?
Yeah, thanks, Ronald. So I'll start probably with the question of the practicalities of assessment, because I think that was brought up a couple of times. So there's a lot of existing data held by local authorities and other public agencies like Nature Scot and SEPA on land hectareage, but also they have detailed data on land use, soil, carbon emissions, and additionally, there's been a lot of scientific research carried out in recent years, especially by universities and organizations that we collaborated with on this proposal, like the James Hutton Institute. And so we think that it would make sense to make use of these expert organizations to carry out the preliminary work in consultation, like I said, with independent consultants. And assessment, we believe assessment would take into consideration both the current emissions baseline, but also the projected emissions, which would help to balance the present and the future. And so landowners are not just banded on their current emissions, but on any potential reductions based on whatever natural carbon capture projects are underway or in the pipeline. And this assessment process would also take into account some of the more specific challenges faced by the individual landowners. So this is a recognition that baselines will vary. So some are going to start with high emissions and others start with negative emissions. And so the aim of the tax is for all land holdings to narrow the gap between existing emissions and potential reductions. So in an ideal world, all landowners would be, would be a zero rated maximum carbon capture, but in the real world, that will obviously take time. I think I saw a question about how many land holdings fall in this threshold. So there's only 754 private estates. So the assessment wouldn't be as onerous as, for example, a council tax. And these 754 estates cover 40,000 square kilometers of privately owned land. And there's also a further 12,000 square kilometers owned by NGOs and government agencies, including the trust. So we ourselves would be liable for this tax. And then on the other points about biodiversity, so we would expect that standards would be developed, which would form part of the assessment process and emphasize not only long-term sequestration, but biodiversity, cost-saving benefits and community benefits. And land management practices like natural regeneration are quite easily achieved because all you need to do is keep grazing pressures quite low. So the benefits of that approach, we believe, would be reflected in the banding system and to try and encourage best practice in land management. I think I'll stop there and open it up to more questions.
Thanks very much. If I could ask the other panelists to turn their cameras on, please. We can now maybe take some of the questions from our audience. There've been a lot of questions. First of all, under the label of tax revenue, if we can think about that first of all. Questions here: would the taxes that your proposal would raise, Jenny, would these taxes go direct to? Sorry, Nikki, I beg your pardon. Would these taxes go direct to either Westminster or Holyrood? Is there a possibility of the taxes or a percentage of the taxes being spent in the communities in the area where the tax is raised? And kind of touching this next point, should the tax revenue be ring-fenced and used specifically for biodiversity and sequestration investment schemes?
So a couple of points on that. I mean, our proposal suggests that the revenues raised could pay into this carbon capture fund, which could help, communities, particularly small scale landholders, and help them in that sort of transition to net zero. But we also think that we're only proposing the sort of general principle rather than any sort of specifics, because we don't want to, preempt this sort of expert assessment for emissions and uses. But the figures, the revenue raised is not, it's quite small in comparison to the overall climate change budget. So the figures are not really integral to the policy so much. We think that this would sort of be better determined by the sort of fiscal experts who find that balance between what level would be effective and also reasonable. And the point is not to be punitive. It's more about getting results. So any revenues raised might be modest, but the main point of the proposal is to drive this behavior change and approach to land management.
Okay, I wonder if any of the other panelists want to come in on that particular point. So next question is in terms of thinking about farmland. This is a specific question. Again, it's I think specifically directed at you, Nikki. Are you proposing to tax land that fails to sequester carbon to the maximum level, as in your stocking estate example, as well as land which actively emits carbon, which is overwhelmingly degrading peatland? And how would this affect arable farmland?
So we did think about this, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we set the threshold for 1,000 hectares, because 93% of farms fall under the 1,000 hectare threshold. And so therefore they'd be exempt from that taxation. So we actually think the tax will help support farmers in diversifying their land use, and especially as the climate becomes increasingly unpredictable. And it can also help those small scale farmers from bearing that sort of financial brunt of reaching these climate change targets as they're coming up. So we are, we're cognizant of the fact that the agricultural sector in Scotland is really important for our economy and for our culture. And we would try to avoid these unintended consequences that can result from, I think you gave the beef example, John gave the beef example. So we would want to consult, and we'd have to really think about this going forward. And one of the ways that we can sort of minimize the risk of unintended consequences is through consultation and careful design. And this can help shape our thinking about how we can best mitigate these risks.
Okay. Another concern here is in terms of the potential for offshoring and offsetting the taxes. So I think this is from Nick Dominey, who's asked, would big landowners just A, avoid tax, B, pass the tax cost onto wealthy clients, or C, intensify the use of exploited areas? And relatedly, another question here, which I think perhaps it was Jenny that mentioned this in terms of the the big capital inflows we're seeing into Scotland now in terms of it being invested in supposedly carbon offsetting investments. Will this lead to more non-Scots buying up land in Scotland for carbon offsetting?
I mean, I can add a little bit there, I suppose, and just in terms of how we experience it on the ground here in Langham, that around the town we're seeing a lot of land banking from big corporate investment companies. And well, I suppose that obviously that's a wider discussion, but would this kind of mechanism, would that help to level things out? Because at the moment, you know, if there were communities and maybe small land holdings, if people were wanting to buy land and, you know, if it comes up for sale, at the moment prices are just going through the roof. The land that we're trying to buy at the moment has a lot of peatlands on it, and that land price is held at the moment for us, but only till May, and then past that point we're probably not going to, you know, the chances are it's going to go out of reach. So I suppose there's a lot of bigger things going on here as well, but so I suppose it's all, hopefully something like that could help to sort of level things out, or at least bring that revenue back into communities. But yeah, that would be my contribution on that one.
Yeah, that's fine, great. And Nikki, I mean, do you think in the point of landowners trying to avoid the tax, or just passing it on to wealthy clients, is that something that's of concern in terms of the proposal?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is a concern with any tax, I suppose. There's always going to be people who try and dodge the payments and find the various loopholes. So I think the only thing that we can do in terms, you know, I'm not a tax expert, and the trust doesn't claim to have all the answers to how to stop tax avoiders, but I think the best we can do is try and carefully design this proposal with a lot of foresight to try and reduce the risk and mitigate the impact.
I wouldn't have thought avoidance would be a particularly big problem with the tax, because, you know, the land is very obviously there. It can't be sort of shifted around or concealed or so on. I mean, I think there would be, I think the issues of measurement are quite important, because landowners might sort of legally challenge it in the courts, and if the methodology isn't very clear, then, you know, there's scope to get tied up in the courts. But I wouldn't have thought avoidance was a big issue. I mean, as to the kind of wealthy people or people with wealthy clients, you know, simply, if you like, swallowing the tax and not changing their behaviour, I guess you'd have to set the rates of it sufficiently high that, you know, that they did change their behaviour. So you know, I don't. You know, Nikki said not punitive, but you'd have to. There wouldn't be much point unless you set the rates high enough that people's behaviour was impacted. You know, quite how far you would go to that, and, you know, that involves trading off. You know, do you want the revenue, or are you more concerned with the, you know, are you more concerned with the behavioural shift? But even if you're just concerned with behavioural shift and not bothered about the revenue at all, you still have to fix the rate pretty high just to make sure you had an impact on behaviour.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think obviously the reason economists tend to really like land taxes is they are perhaps the most difficult tax to avoid. So I don't think that is such an issue here. Now, there's quite a bit here on concerns about the timescale. So if I can just run this by everybody. So if you're at the start of a, say, 20-year journey to transition to a better place, is it right that you should be taxed based on your current situation, or is there some way of factoring the potential of each holding into the process? And how will the move to lower tax bands happen over time? Measuring change in the ground would be very long term. Could, for example, a move to a lower band be based upon a legally enforceable management plan? This may make initial entry more palatable without the inevitable rouses to get around it in terms of splitting holdings up, say, or making ownership near impossible to track down. So some good points there, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is something that we considered when we were making the proposal. So we would expect that the assessment would take into consideration not only the current emission baseline, but also the projected emission reduction if they were taking measures to reduce emissions and to sort of balance activity versus actuality. So landowners would not just be banded on their current emissions, but on their projected reductions or emissions as well. And in terms of the moving to lower tax bands over time, well, the land holdings would be regularly reevaluated in order to assess any changes in the land use based on, you know, any actions that they took or modeling of emissions benefits. So there would be an interval between assessments, and this would be determined, I suppose, by what was practical, taking into account public resources and timescales. But in between routine assessment, there could also be provisions for individual landowners to request a reevaluation based on change of land use. So a landowner who has taken a lot of steps to cut down emissions and increase sequestration could expect to move down a band following an evaluation, or up a band if they are currently emitting carbon. And as monitoring becomes a bit more sophisticated over time, the banding could then also be refined to encourage that longer term carbon storage and other metrics that we were talking about, like biodiversity and health and well-being.
Okay, great. Okay, there's a question here which I think is probably for you, Andrew, relates to timber. And I think it relates to some of the points you made about the intensity of energy use in, for example, steel production and concrete production. The question is, can the world grow enough timber for construction when current timber volume is about 20 times less than concrete volumes? And secondly, as the demand changes, would the supply not grow to match? And thirdly, and as a follow-up, can the supply grow fast enough to keep up?
I'm going to have to do one question at a time. My brain isn't working. My brain isn't working well enough at the moment. So I suppose this is part of what I was saying, the point I was making about the kind of wider impacts around carbon. So at the moment, I normally live in Edinburgh, and I live in Edinburgh, I'm just not there at the moment. And they have a net zero by 2030 target that doesn't include embodied carbon in construction. So at the moment, we're demolishing 20, 30-year-old concrete buildings in Edinburgh, rebuilding them in more concrete, and slapping a solar panel on top of it and calling it carbon neutral. And that's the big issue in all of this, is we can't just look at a single aspect and push down. We've got to look at a much bigger picture. So we could reduce demand for timber and reduce demand for concrete by having, carbon policies that look at embodied carbon in construction. So by and as I say, we need a much more holistic approach to all of these challenges if we're going to tackle global warming. I think the figure is something like 3% of global forests are plantations, and they supply about 30% of global roundwood input. I think it's a figure. It's round about that aspect. And so if you look at the UK as a whole, has only got about 12% tree cover. The European average is about 40%. And how do we historic to land use? We regulate land use in completely different ways. We reward land use management in completely different ways. So there are some big fundamental challenges here about how do we, the best example is if you wanted to build a hotel and you had to get planning permission for a hotel, someone would look how many hotels in an area. But when we talk about land use and supporting and regulating land use, we have a very different approach. And should we be taking perhaps as part of this wider carbon approach, should we take a very different approach to regulating land use? For example, some aspects of arable farming, if we're producing, if we're farming to produce maize for a anaerobic digester, for example, how do we regulate that? Why do we regulate short rotation coppice very differently to short rotation forestry? At the moment, it's completely differently regulated and completely differently supported. So there are some big fundamental challenges here that we need to address. So I'm a big fan of mass timber and cross-laminated timber, and there's some great demonstrations of how we can use that. But we don't always need to use cross-laminated, mass timber. There's a great phrase which is more buildings in timber and less timber in buildings. Have I got the right way around? Yeah. So we don't always need to use cross-laminated timber. We could be using lighter weight timber frames. So it is part of this embodied carbon in construction is a real key issue. I think I've answered one of those three questions.
Yeah, I think that's great. No, that is good. I think your memory is better than you think. Yeah. Okay, so got another one here if we've got time. I think we have. Yeah. This is quite a technical one. It's the assessment of the tax. So someone is saying that this is a great idea, but how is the carbon going to be assessed? I think John, you mentioned that in your response. Person goes on to say the last AgriCalc audit in 2019, I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it didn't include the methane reduction of our anaerobic digester, our 90% reduction in drugs and drenches, the contribution from our 35,000 newly planted mixed broadleaf trees, our 25 years of documented soil carbon data showing sequestration of over 5 tons per hectare per year. Then there's the GWP 100 versus GW star debate, question mark. Now there's quite a lot to unpack there. Nikki, do you want to take that on?
I'll try my best to tackle that. I think I can't say much about the specifics to the AgriCalc tool, except that we would expect the assessment to be an adaptation of similar existing tools like that and other sort of farming audit resources that are available. I think in the interests of fairness, we could publish any agreed methodologies that we end up using and make it publicly available in order to increase transparency and accountability. And I suppose as knowledge progresses, we could adapt and change our assessment as needed. For example, in the Scottish government, their greenhouse gas emissions assessment recently reevaluated how they assess land use change and forestry emissions. And so where land use used to be a big carbon sink based on reevaluation due to updated knowledge and scientific information, that's where we get this new figure that land is not a carbon sink anymore. So we would be wise to keep abreast of all the changes that are happening in this really fast moving area, and to make sure that any method that is used is accountable and transparent and fair. I think that's all I can say on that, to be honest.
Thanks very much. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up on that. No, that's fine. Well, we're almost at an end. Perhaps I could ask a question of my own. I mentioned at the beginning that obviously charging companies for their carbon emissions per ton of carbon emissions is becoming very popular. Problem is that different countries have different tariffs for carbon emissions. But what we are seeing is that the kind of figure that is normally used for carbon taxes of around $40 per ton is not nearly high enough, particularly to get at the kind of energy, fossil fuel use in the kind of things that Andrew mentioned, steel production and cement. And I noticed recently that the OECD were talking about a rate of about 130 euros per ton to get at these heavier duty aspects of getting to net zero. So my question is, I just wondered in terms of, for example, the point that Andrew made about, switching to timber, do you think your tax, Nikki, could be a more efficient and cost-effective tax perhaps than the kind of punitive rates that we would need in terms of charging per ton of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Ronald. And what's quite interesting and unique, I suppose, about this proposal is that it hasn't really been introduced in any other countries before, and a lot of countries, they have carbon taxes that are specific to fuel and energy consumption. But in pioneering this new land tax, we would actually be demonstrating leadership in terms of policy solutions to the climate emergency, and that would be quite a unique angle to take, and possibly more effective in terms of land's potential to help tackle the climate emergency. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that was just my impressions based on your thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's very good. Thank you. Well, I think we are at the end of our allotted time. I think before I wrap up, we have the answer to the first question that we were given at the beginning, the first poll that we undertook. So if I could ask us to show the answer to that, please. Oh, sorry, we're going to ask that question again. I beg your pardon. Yeah. So after we've heard our discussions today, do you think we need a carbon emissions tax for land? Yes or no? Simple binary question here. It's hard to imagine that's going to change much from the start, but it'd be interesting to see the result. I'm not sure if we're able to see the results of that poll at the moment. Okay, well, that includes our event this evening, and I would like to thank everyone who's participated, our panelists, particularly Nikki Gordon, John Cullinan, Jenny Barlow, Andrew Heald, and Sarah Ann Minoz, and the contributing artists, Mark Galley, Sue Ali, and Hamish Napier, and everyone who has attended. I just missed the result there, but there we are, yeah. So it is interesting. So some people have changed their minds since the start of the talk, but not a big percentage. So still pretty big support for your proposal, I think, Nikki. Yeah, which is good, I think.
Great.
SEDA's next event will be the SEDA Solar Seminar, Solar Expert Design, Relation and Maintenance on Monday, the 15th of November. And on December the 6th, SEDA will also be holding its annual Christmas show and tell at the new pop-up space for architecture, carbon and environment in Edinburgh. And for the first time, SEDA will be inviting non-SEDA members to come and get a flavour of what SEDA members are involved with. And I would encourage people to think about, to go to the SEDA website and find a bit more about what SEDA does and all the exciting things it's involved in, and perhaps consider becoming a member of SEDA. And if you're interested in finding out more about the John Muir Trust campaign that we've heard about this evening, please scan the QR code on the right of your screen at the moment. But just to close, I'd like to thank everybody, both panelists and audience, for your contributions and attendance tonight. I think it's been a really interesting and successful event, and I look forward to more of these events in the future. Thanks very much, everybody.